Hey there. Today we're going to talk about Rupert Quaintance. Now, he's a name that many people are familiar with, so let's just dive right into that, okay? So the first thing to know about Rupert Quaintance is that he was actually involved about a year prior to him kind of coming onto the scene and being noticed anywhere in the UK. He was an American, living in Virginia, and he put up a video in which he basically talked about his feelings upon seeing the videos of the two children that were put out at the start of the hoax. And like any normal person, he was horrified. However, he took the view that what had happened to these children was some form of satanic ritual abuse, and he talked about going to Hampstead and kicking down doors, drawing people's blood, and finding out what the hell had happened. So, you know, you can sort of think of that as maybe blowing off steam a little bit. You can think of it as just standard conspiranoid nutcasery. About a year after he put out that video, Angela Power Disney happened upon it, or perhaps she knew about it already. We don't know exactly how that happened. I imagine that will come out when she's on trial. She started up a conversation with Rupert. Now, Rupert is an interesting guy, and I want to be very careful about how I talk about him in this video, and I would ask that maybe our commenters exercise a little bit of restraint as well, keeping in mind that he is now under a restraining order which prevents him from making any comeback. So I want to be as fair as I possibly can in describing exactly what happened, because I think that if we just use this as a, let's slam Rupert video, that's not fair to anyone, and he can't respond. I think having the right of reply is crucial, even if we disagree or think that the person is out to lunch. They should have the right to reply, and he doesn't. So let's keep it fair, okay? When Rupert got in touch with Angela, or she got in touch with him, which seems more likely because she was at that time, as I said in my video about her, she was at that time really kind of fishing for further support, probably from the North American front. I think she kind of realized that the UK market had been pretty much tapped out, that all of the major league conspiracy nutcases had really kind of had their thing to say about the Hampstead hoax. Many of them had either been arrested or had been cautioned and told to stop putting stuff up. And she was on a binge, I suppose, of finding new blood, and preferably new American blood, because then she could kind of own that market. We've talked about how she wanted to be the Queen of Hampstead, which is a little tiny bit like becoming the King of Siberia, quite frankly. Like, why would anyone want to? But I guess we get our attention any way we can, especially if we're Angela. She did a few things that are very typical Angela things. She recorded their conversation, not necessarily with his knowledge or consent, as usual. Now, we know that she did this also to a number of other people, including Abraham and Ella, for whom I have approximately this much sympathy. But I do think that when you're on a Skype call to someone, if you're recording it, you kind of have an obligation to let them know. I think that some of the videos that she recorded of herself chatting with Sabine about kidnapping the children and so on and so forth contributed to Sabine's conviction and sentence. So good going, Angela. Well done. Nice play. Similarly, the videos that she made with Rupert, and which she put online without his knowledge or consent, although he did know about them afterwards and I believe made a bit of a stink about it, those were actually used later. They would be used in his trial, and when the jury saw them, I think it helped them to understand the fear that he was putting into the people that he was accusing of being satanic pedophile, cannibals, not carnivores, cannibals, although carnivores too, I suppose, if you're a cannibal. In the videos, Angela put on a fair bit of pressure for him to come to the UK, which was a bit rich considering that she lived in between Ireland and Lanzarote, where she was nice and safe from, or she thought she was anyway, from being charged in the case. Whereas if he went to the UK, he'd basically be a sitting duck. And despite the fact that people sort of made it clear what would happen if he came, he did. So one of the first things that Angela did was start up a GoFundMe, because back in the day, that was Angela's MO. That was one of the things that she liked to do to get the ball rolling. She donated a certain amount of money of her own. I believe it was €1,000, if I'm not mistaken, although I could be wrong on that. And basically encouraged other people to donate to getting Rupert to the UK to quote-unquote investigate the Hampstead hoax. Now, the problem with coming to investigate a hoax, if you are a person who has already stated that you believe that the people who were accused are guilty, that's not really so much an investigation as it is a terror attack. And that is how it was taken. People were not at all happy that Rupert was going to be in their community. He kept saying that he had special skills. He was going to make them squeal. He was going to take them to a pub, and and if the police came to arrest him, that he would box their ears or just run really fast. How'd that work out for you, Rupert? I think it's fair to say that he had a very unrealistic view of what he would be encountering when he came to the UK, and he was very quickly set right. One of the first things that happened was that he had received an invitation from someone who has always been a very big supporter of the accused side of the Hampstead hoax, and that was Shiva Burton, who's a lovely person. And I think she wanted to kind of have a word with him, put a flea in his ear about some of the people that he would be associating with, and I think that's a fair thing to do. Angela heard about this and the attacks that she launched against Shiva, because apparently by this time Angela believed that Rupert was in love with her and she was in love with him, and they were going to sail off into the sunset together or something. Anyway, Angela had a shit fit and attacked Shiva viciously, just viciously, as only Angela can. So that didn't go over so well. Anyway, he went off and did some other project that he was involved in. A guy named Kevin Galilei was doing a hunger fast, a hunger strike outside the Vatican, which apparently made a huge impact on the Pope. I'm sure he was very impressed. He wasn't at all impressed. I don't think he noticed. Rupert shows up in the UK eventually in about August, and from his own account, Rupert referred to some of the people that he was seeing in the UK as MK trauma vampires, and that they like to sit around watching MK ultra trauma porn, which I actually found kind of a humorous observation on his part and pretty accurate. Not at all unfair on his part to say that. However, that didn't stop him from being like Mr. Tough Guy. He and Angela took a road trip and went to see Jake Clark in hospital. They didn't get to see him. However, they did see a nurse, and they were vicious about her. They were just really, really cruel. I don't know what the poor woman did look like, but according to Rupert, she was some kind of freak of nature. Essentially, I think that was his way of saying he didn't get his own way. He also put up her phone number and so forth. This really did not endear him to anyone, honestly. And actually, I believe that Angela's relationship with Rupert was part of what would eventually form the schism, and sort of the final breaking point of Angela's kind of relationship with the rest of the Hampstead hoax team. I think they basically just had enough of her at that point, and I think Rupert contributed to that by just being, I guess there's a cultural difference. Canadians don't quite always get the American way either. We're a little bit appalled sometimes by the loudness and bounciness, I guess. It's kind of like when in Winnie the Pooh, when Tigger would come to visit and he'd just bounce everything. You kind of get that sensation sometimes. The next thing we knew, he put up a photo on Facebook of Christ Church and said, "I pissed on your church." Now, I don't think you have to be a parishioner at that church to be offended by that. I think doing that on any house of worship in any religion is a really offensive thing to do. And I think it was done out of bravado and just, wanting to kind of literally make his mark. I had a dog that used to do that, but hey, whatever. A couple of days later, he put up another post on Facebook. This one was himself standing outside the gates of Christ Church Primary School, and in that photo he said that he intimated that he was carrying a knife. It's a biscuit is slang for a knife. It's actually a brand of pocket knives that are kind of scary looking when you have a look at them. I'll put up a photo here. He's outside the school gates. The timing of that post, I really don't think it could have been worse. It was literally 9 a.m. on the first morning of the new school term. So parents of children at that school who had already spent the past 2.5 years being harassed and basically stalked by other people, including Sabine, as we later found out, would get up and discover that their children's school had some American guy who had already said that he was coming to kick down doors, break heads, take blood, and now he was standing outside their children's school saying he was carrying a knife. If you put yourself in the position of those parents, that's a pretty terrifying thing to say. And it really did not serve Rupert well. That was actually one of the major points of evidence which would later come up in his trial. He was staying in a house in southeast London, and he took a video of himself out there, and we were able to work out by massive teamwork that I really had nothing to do with. That was actually done by a whole bunch of our commenters, and I had been out for the day and came back to find this pile of people saying, okay, so we've worked out the latitude and longitude and which direction is he facing, and there's a church over there that has a particular kind of spire. It was really, really astonishing. I was shocked and kind of delighted at the teamwork that had gone into that, just because none of these people knew each other. They were all just they wanted to see something done, because that whole thing was just getting out of hand. Rupert was arrested. He was arrested in September 2016. He had his passport taken from him, and he was told he would not be able to work, but that he would be on bail until such time as the CPS decided what his charges would be and when his trial would be. So, as is the way in the justice system, once you get used to it, you realize that everything just moves at a snail's pace. In August of 2017, Rupert's trial finally happened. Now, in between those his arrest and the trial, he had basically been told not to talk about Hampstead, and he did very well with that. He did not breach that, as far as I'm aware. Rupert had a conversation with a couple of different people, both of whom sent copies of the conversation to me because they were concerned, and they thought it would be useful to know, and useful for the police to know eventually when Angela ever got charged, which still hasn't happened, but we're waiting. Rupert had sent them conversations about the time that he had spent with Angela, and essentially said that he had felt that she had sexually molested him, and that if it had happened to a woman, people would have been up in arms about it. And I can understand that. I agree with that. From his description of what happened, it does sound very much like a sexual assault. And yes, I do think that can go in both directions. I think it can happen from women to men and men to women. So, and I don't think it was appropriate. And I do feel badly for him that it happened. Unfortunately, he chose some very, very bad friends. That was the crux of the matter. So the trial begins. And unlike the previous trial of Neelu and Sabine in the summer of 2016, this one was a fairly low-key, quiet kind of thing. There was very little wrangling in the halls. None of the usual supporters showed up except for Belinda and a couple of people that I actually didn't know. Someone named Neil, a friend of hers. Don't know who he was. I do remember sitting in the hall on the first morning and having nothing better to do, and Belinda was sitting just a few seats down the row from me, and I had nothing better to do, so I took notes on the conversations that she was having. It was actually really interesting, because it's from those conversations, it was clear that she and Rupert seemed to have a bit of a different perspective on what was going on. Her perspective was that there was no one there to support Rupert, and that was because the trial had been decided in advance, and that's because the officer in charge, Detective Constable Martin, was a member of the gang. Ooh. Yeah, she actually said that. Anyway, then the next day she wasn't quite as talkative, because I think she realized that maybe I was taking notes, because I'd kind of published them in the previous day's blog. But anyway, moving along. That's the other thing. You learn about trials. They always take for friggin' ever, and they never come out when they say they're going to, and none of the timing ever works. Everyone just sit down, do your jobs, get this thing over with, and let's get home. But no, it's never like that. It's just not how it works. So the prosecution, Martin Bowyer, I think it was Bowyer. He talked right off the bat about how the internet involved freedom of speech. With enormous freedom of speech comes certain responsibilities. It's a little bit like your right to free speech ends when you put my life in danger or put me in fear for my life. That was the bottom line. So the defendant, Mr. Bowyer said, used that freedom of the internet to cause people to fear that violence would be used against them, and it was a legitimate fear. How do you quantify that? Now, one of the things that sort of happened throughout the trial was that Rupert seemed to kind of poo-poo the idea that the people that he had been harassing actually felt fear. It was like, oh, stop being such babies. I don't know about Rupert, but I don't like people making death threats against me and my children or my family. That's just not a cool thing to do. And I don't know how he would have felt had the shoe been on the other foot. I do think that was a bit of a mistake that he made, especially because the jury saw him doing it. And one of the things that juries don't like, generally, are defendants who basically poo-poo and write off the effects of what they've done. I mean, I think, this is just my opinion, but I have the sense that if he had gone in there and said, oh my God, I had no idea I was having this effect on people, I'm so sorry, I would never have done this had I known, he might still have been found guilty, possibly, but I think he would have got less of a sentence, because I think that kind of thing gives the jury the opportunity to see you as a person who's made a mistake, rather than some dumbass who got sucked into, a situation that they don't know that much about, shot off their mouth, did a bunch of really foolish things, and wound up getting slammed for it. Now, one of Rupert's defense lawyers' big arguments that Rupert was being made a fall guy. And in some ways, that was kind of a convincing argument, because you could see how the people involved in this hoax had basically brought him to the UK under the impression that he would be taken care of, looked after, his, monetary needs would be dealt with, and he winds up stuck way the hell out in Erith, where it costs a bloody fortune to get into the middle of the city, so he was pretty much stuck out there, and on bail for an entire year, and unable to leave the country. He really did not get what he bargained for, and I think that was in part because he was sold a bill of goods, and in part because he didn't look at the goods very carefully before he bought them. So one of the things that Rupert would say during his trial, or his lawyer would say on his behalf, is that he was subject to a huge amount of abuse, and he said that most of that abuse came from our blog. Now, I accept that that is probably true up until the point when he was arrested. Following that, I don't think there was anything said about him on the blog, because I put a moratorium on any comments being posted about him or the trial. And that's because I don't want our blog to be in conflict with the law, which it would be. It would be in contempt of court. However, prior to that, a lot of people expressed a lot of anger. And yeah, I can imagine that he probably felt a bit threatened by that. On the other hand, you have to wonder why people were so angry. Was it because they felt afraid? I mean, I actually wrote to Rupert at one point, using my Snake Logan Hushmail account, and asked him I thought very courteously, I tried to ask him to reconsider coming to the UK, because I felt as though he was being set up by people who didn't have his best interests at heart. And his response to that was basically, thanks but no thanks. And that was the end of that conversation. I felt badly about that, because I would have really liked to have had a person-to-person conversation with him where I could essentially try and help him see, I'm going to say, the error of his ways. Because honestly, I think it was a terrible, terrible mistake to come over. So I'm not going to go over all of the evidence that was raised during Rupert's trial, because it's long. There's a lot of it. I will, however, put the links to Rupert's trial in the box below the video, so you can have a look for yourself if you're interested. There was quite a lot of very substantive evidence, including the videos in which poor old Angela Power Disney gets named in court again. Aw dear, that's just so sad. When Rupert took the stand, he was really, I think, the only witness in his own defense. He said basically that he hadn't been able to anticipate how people were going to take what he was doing. Honestly, I'm a little bit taken aback by that. I was taken aback by that when I heard it, because we had tried and tried and tried and tried to explain that. And we basically got a blank wall. It's really hard to describe to someone from the outside what it's like to feel as though your children's life, your own life, the life even of your cats and dogs, are in danger. To know that your child can't go to school without being accompanied by an adult at all times. Children at that school, and who transferred to other schools even, had to ensure that they had teachers with them at all times. They couldn't go off on field trips. They had to be near the teacher. They couldn't even go to the washroom by themselves. They couldn't go to the toilet without a teacher walking along, making sure that no adult accosted them on the way, walking them back to the classroom. And these are kids aged 10 to 12. This was the age that they were going into. That's a time when children should be beginning to find a little bit of freedom and responsibility for themselves, and yet here they were being put in a position where they had to be in fear at all times. And even if their parents didn't fully explain to them what was going on, and I think some parents explained everything, some parents tried to keep the children from really knowing what was happening because it was too scary, but I think basically everyone's lives were turned upside down. We heard more about that during Sabine's trial when we heard about parents who were sleeping on the floors of their children's bedrooms because they were fearful that someone was going to break in the night and steal their children. Saying that that's an exaggeration or that they should just stop being so sensitive already, no, I don't think so. I don't think that's right. I think what should happen is that when police have information that could lead to the arrest of some of the people doing this, get those arrest warrants ready, folks. We're going in. People should be held to account for the fear in which they place other people. One of the other things that happened was that Rupert remained convinced that the main person involved in harassing him was one of the protected witnesses. That didn't go over well either, because the police know that our blog is not run by that person. It's not a secret. They know who runs our blog. They've always known because I've told them. The judge asked Rupert whether he had any examples of the death threats that he claimed to have received from people associated with Hampstead Research. Like pretty much everyone who's claimed to have received death threats from Hampstead Research, Rupert said that he had not. The judge also asked him for an example of some abuse that he might have suffered at the hands of Hampstead Research, and referred to a gentleman by the name of Roger Flutterby, who had called him, I believe, a creepy knuckle-dragging twat, and asked Rupert whether this was something that he remembered reading. And Rupert said he'd say that was light. The judge agreed with him. At one point, the judge said something along the lines of, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen, which seems kind of apropos to a lot of people involved in the Hampstead hoax. They seem to believe that it's perfectly okay to accuse other people of horrible, unbelievable, god-awful crimes, like just the most terrible crimes imaginable. Murder, child sexual abuse, cannibalism, just hideous stuff. They seem to think that it's okay to talk about other people doing that. But if you point out that these people have actually, done their own brand of defamation, if you point that out to them, it's like, ooh, you're a terrible person. Why did you even say that? Now you're harassing me. Go away, bad person. It's really hard to get people to see that their own behavior has an impact on other people. And that was, I think, probably one of the main things that was taken away from the Rupert trial. Now, the other thing that happened, he was found guilty on, I believe it was 2 of 5 charges, and was sentenced to he was sentenced to 9 months in prison. He served 4.5 and got out on good behavior. I do not even a little bit envy him for having had to go to Wandsworth. I understand that it's basically a shithole, and that's unfortunate. When he got out, he had to go to a deportation center and had to await his turn on the next flight, basically, and I guess that probably took a few days as well. So overall, a really nasty, unpleasant experience for him. I think if I had been a member of his family, I would have been desperate with worry and concern about my child. I also would have said, "What the hell do you think you're doing, you knucklehead?" But that's just me. After Rupert was convicted and while he was serving his sentence, as is fairly usual in this kind of case, there was an appeal launched against both, I believe, the sentence and the guilty judgment. And that failed. Now, that's only interesting because it set us up for the next trial to come, which was Sabine's. Because when one of the things that was determined in Rupert's case that became important in law was that if you were seen to be stalking and harassing a group, members of that group could legitimately claim that they personally had been stalked and harassed, even if they were not necessarily named by name in that by the person alleged to be stalking them. That was a very important piece of case law, which would later come back to bite Sabine on the ass, although she didn't know this at the time. So overall, it worked out. He lost a lot of time out of his life dealing with a situation which, frankly, I think could have been averted. I don't think he necessarily needed to do everything that he did, and I also think that he was led astray by a lot of people who gave him some very strange ideas and led him to believe that he would be protected when he could not be protected. It's a sad story. It's also, I think, a cautionary tale for people who think that it's okay to go online and harass other people and perpetuate a hoax. So there you go. I hope I've been fair and not too harsh about this. And, if Rupert wants to talk to me personally about it, you're welcome to contact me on Twitter or via our blog's email. If you have anything that you would like to say to me personally about this, I'll be happy to talk to you. Okay? So take care, guys, and we'll see you soon. Bye now.